Welcome everyone to the fourth installment of our Popular Culture and Populism online lecture series. I'm Leonie de Jonge. I'm an assistant professor in European politics and society at the University of Groningen. And before introducing today's speaker, let me say a few words about our lecture series, which is kindly brought to you, and bear with me as I read off the sponsors of this series: the Groningen Institute for the Study of Culture, the Research Center for the Arts and Society, the Research Center for the Study of Democratic Cultures and Politics, and the research project Popular Music and the Rise of Populism in Europe, which is financed by the Volkswagen Stiftung. Now, in this lecture series, we are bringing together different approaches for understanding connections between populism and popular culture. So some of the questions we hope to discuss in the series are: what is the relation between populism and the popular? What does it mean when populism takes shape of popular culture, or when popular culture disseminates populist discourses? And what role does the audience play in all this? The speakers in this series are approaching these questions from a range of different perspectives and disciplines. So we've already heard from Mario Dunkel, who discussed the role of populism and popular music. We then heard from John Street, who talked about populism and celebrity politics. And last week, we heard from Evian Leidig, who told us all about algorithmic populism, notably by discussing how female alt-right influencers use gendered narratives on social media platforms for recruitment and radicalization. This week, we will hear from Professor Ruth Wodak, who will share insights on the shameless normalization of message control by drawing on insights from the Austrian case study. Now, Ruth is one of the few scholars who really doesn't need a formal introduction, because most of you know her, but she certainly deserves a formal introduction. So Ruth is Emerita Distinguished Professor of Discourse Studies at Lancaster University in the UK, and currently she is a Senior Visiting Fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna, Austria. Over the course of her career, she has been awarded numerous prestigious prizes, which I really cannot read off all to you, but just to name a few: the Grand Decoration of Honor in Silver for services to the Republic of Austria, as well as the Lebenswerk Prize for her lifetime achievements from the Austrian Ministry of Women's Affairs. Professor Wodak is also a member of the British Academy of Social Sciences. She serves on the editorial boards of a range of distinguished academic journals, including Discourse and Society, Critical Discourse Studies, Language and Politics, and various others. And in the past, she has also held visiting professorships at a range of prestigious universities, including Stanford, Georgetown, and many others. Now, one of the things that make Ruth so interesting is that her interests span a broad range of topics, such as discourse studies, gender and identity politics, and political communication and populism. She has published 10 monographs, 29 co-authored monographs, 60 edited volumes and special issues journals, and more than 420 peer-reviewed journals and book chapters. Her most recent book, is called The Politics of Fear: The Shameless Normalization of Far-Right Populist Discourses, which was published by Sage in 2021, which I can highly recommend and which I regularly draw from both in my research and teaching. Ruth, we are so honored to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for this wonderful introduction. I feel very honored and humbled, and I hope I can sort of accommodate all these expectations. First, I would like to just say I will only talk about popular culture a bit, and actually I'm very interested in the sort of blurring of media, entertainment, information, and the dissemination to various audiences. So I believe that those clear fields have changed very much, and that we are experiencing a blurring of boundaries between all these fields of politics, of popular culture, etc. So in that way, I will also give examples which manifest this blurring of boundaries and how the far right instrumentalize this blurring of boundaries. So to start, I would just like to briefly say what I'm going to talk about. I will first talk about what Leonie already was so kind to mention, the normalization to the right, which is, I think, the really important shift between what we experienced in the sort of first three stages of the far-right populist movements, and now the way these ideologies and beliefs are being normalized also via discourse and in discourse and in very many fields in our society. I will then briefly introduce you to some concepts, and then I will focus on provocation, scandalization, and normalization, and how I believe this blurring of boundaries works. I have three examples. I hope to get through all of them, and Leonie is going to wave to me if I talk too long, and then I will briefly summarize and conclude. So first, to talk about just some brief assumptions which guide my work about the normalization and shameless normalization. It's important to me to talk about the shamelessness as well, because sort of changes have always been part and parcel of our societies, and there are various different kinds of normalizations, not only the far right, which had been marginalized and then has become mainstream, but also left wing. And so we've all experienced a normalization of gay culture, for example, at least in Western democracies. And we have experienced a normalization, for example, of anti-Muslim sentiments coming from the far right. I want to talk specifically about the shamelessness, which means that not only do discursive shifts occur, but also the boundaries of the sayable are being changed significantly, and we experience a kind of discourse and also policies which would have been unbelievable just 10 years ago. It's not just Donald Trump, but of course he symbolizes the shift, especially also in discourse and via his tweets, but also in other countries and other politicians. So the post-war conventions have really been challenged and also changed in many aspects. And the term, the post-shame, I was pointed to that when I lectured in Tel Aviv, and one of my colleagues there said, well, we're not actually dealing with post-truth, we're dealing with post-shame. And I think he is so right, because post-truth would imply that politicians have not lied before. But we know, and Hannah Arendt has already stated that in the 1970s very clearly, we've always dealt with politicians who lied. But now the resonance and the reactions are so different. So it doesn't matter. Politicians lie, and it just doesn't matter. We have fake news, alternative news, whatever concept you want to use, disinformation, it doesn't matter. And I think this is the significant shift. It's not the post-truth, it's really, I believe, the shamelessness of being confronted with lies, with insults, with fake news, etc., and it just doesn't matter. So this is basically what I claim to juxtapose the basically quite normal changes which have already been described by Foucault, by Fairclough, etc., and by Jürgen Link, which have been called normalization, but now we have a significant difference. So what I would like to now link this to is the notion of propaganda. Because if we talk about shameless normalization, we have to ask ourselves, how does this actually become public? How is it disseminated? And so I thought, actually, we have to go back to the concept of propaganda. Now, propaganda is connotated very negatively ever since there was a propaganda ministry during the Nazi times. There was propaganda sections and bureaucracies in charge of propaganda in the former Stalinist communist countries. But basically, propaganda is a very old tool and, of course, also linked to rhetoric. And there's a very interesting paper by Douglas Walton from the 1970s, 1997, where he mentions 10 characteristics of propaganda. Douglas Walton is a theorist in argumentation theory. I'm not going to go in his argumentation theory now, but I'm interested in what he says about propaganda and how to link this to the discourse analysis of the shameless normalization. First of all, I'm not also going to list all of his points and also not discuss all the details. I want to list 5. First of all, that propaganda is always dialogic, as is any media message and, of course, any message in popular culture, that we always have message content plus argument. That means somebody wants you to believe something which you have not believed before. Yeah, so they want to persuade you of something. There is the link to rhetoric and all the sort of tools in rhetoric which politicians still use, but also, of course, tools in advertising. Yeah, and we know that the commodification of politics is very important in this context. We have a goal-directed structure. That means the politician wants to get the respondent to carry out or support or stop a particular action. That means it's a call, it's an appeal to action, it's you want to achieve something. And of course, it's manipulated. And in this way, Walton takes manipulation into propaganda. I know that some theorists distinguished between manipulation and propaganda and persuasion. So for Douglas Walton, it's part and parcel of propaganda, and that means logical reasoning does not have any role anymore. And this is, of course, a very important characteristic of far-right populism. I call this the arrogance of ignorance. That means they appeal to common sense, to intuition, what we know from whatever kind of knowledge, and it's completely in denial of scientific, expert opinions, facts, etc. So the manipulation then links to the message content where you want to persuade somebody of something which obviously is indifferent to logical reasoning. But most important for me in this context is orchestration. And orchestration, which Walton describes, means propaganda manipulates different media over time to produce a cumulative message, which is indifferent to logical reason, but also manipulates listeners, viewers, readers to believe something which they didn't believe before, and to do something. And that can be misuse of statistics, opinion polls, repetition of such disinformation, etc. And this is what I'm really interested in. How do far-right populists, especially if they are in power, manipulate audiences to believe something which they have not believed before, and which is also disinformation. So let me show you an example. Some of you might know this example already because I've used it also in my book, but I think it's basically such a good example, so I have to use it. And it's how certain appeals to the people, exactly what Walt says what propaganda does, the appeal to the people, the topos, the argument ad populum, which is at the core of far-right populism, but also, of course, left-wing populism. It depends on the content which you want to disseminate, how that has become normalized. On the top, you see Jörg Haider, who some of you might not know anymore. He was a very charismatic, far-right Austrian politician of the Austrian Freedom Party, who won 27% of the national votes already in 1999. And at that time, we spoke of the Haiderization of Europe, because he also and his party launched a particular kind of far-right populist rhetoric. And in that way, that has become a model for many other populist politicians. And here you have a very typical slogan, he who speaks our language. Our language means the language of the small men, women on the streets. And you see him laughing, talking to people. He's very connected. He was also always tanned and very handsome. And you only see white people. And this slogan was taken up, and that's really interesting, 2019, literally, word by word, by both the far and extreme right then Minister of the Interior Affairs, Herbert Kickl, who's now the leader of the Freedom Party in Austria, and the coalition with the National Conservative Far-Right Party was stopped by the so-called Ibiza affair, which I cannot go into now because that would take hours to explain, but at least you know that this coalition stopped 2019 in May, and a new government then started 2020, and 2019 in November we had elections, and the far-right Kickl used again the same slogan, somebody who talks our language. He was former Minister of the Interior, so you see him surrounded by police and sort of also supporting and protecting us, yeah, via the law and order police. And then you see Sebastian Kurz, who's Chancellor, Prime Minister of Austria, and his color turquoise. And he uses the same slogan, one who speaks our language, but in a different surrounding, in the typical Austrian landscape. You see mountains and green, and you know, Austrian landscape is very important for Austrian identities. And he's again surrounded by people who are also hiking and walking in the mountains, and they're also all white. And in that way, you see how this slogan, this far-right slogan, was normalized to the mainstream, because Kurzen's party was mainstream conservative and has now shifted enormously to the right. So this is a typical case of performance and trying to be authentic. So how do we define far-right populism? This is just, as everybody I'm sure knows, and there are zillion definitions, so I'm just using a very brief one by Irina Krasteva, but you can use any others. I'm just interested in showing what far-right populism has achieved and where it has gone. It is a catalyst from the class politics to value politics, so the traditional left-right narratives have been challenged, and it's about values and norms. It's a shift from party politics to symbolic politics, and I will talk about that in a minute. So just to give you an example, the whole debate about the headscarf is a typical debate about symbolic politics. It's a shift from previous classical narratives, ideological narratives, to identity politics. Who are you? Who do you belong to? Are you one of us or are you not one of us? And the us can always be newly defined from an arbitrarily alleged homogeneous people. And we don't talk, or they don't talk, about socioeconomic issues, which are linked to class politics, but about cultural cleavages. So religion has become a major field of debate, and it has gone away from inequality and other most important and salient political debates. And in that context, I want to emphasize again that for me and for many others, far-right populism is not just an issue of performance, it is also an issue of fragmented ideologies. And there is a lot of content which is realized in different symbolic and visual and other ways. So provocation, scandalization is one of the most important tools in this whole propaganda struggle to reach as many people as possible. And I'm just giving you two examples which I've analyzed with Elena Semino and Jonathan Culpaper in a recent paper in Discourse and Society, published in Discourse and Society. We all remember Donald Trump saying, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters. An example of shamelessness. So Donald Trump constructed himself as standing above all the norms and rules and conventions in our society, because everybody else who would shoot somebody would not only lose voters, but would be imprisoned and taken to court. But he was so self-assured, and that links into not making his tax available to other people, and there are so many examples of the shamelessness in his tweets, which we could talk about for many hours. And it has changed from what, for example, Berlusconi did, because we all know that there are lots of similarities between Berlusconi and Trump, not only in the hairdo. There are many examples where they actually link in the media performance, in the authenticity, which they are both very good at, in the entertaining, and that's where it comes into popular culture, because Trump was an entertainer, and that also was used in his election campaigns. That was also one of the important characteristics of Trumpism, and Berlusconi was an entertainer. In a joint press conference with Dmitry Medvedev, then Russian president, in 2008, he was asked about the relationships between the US and Russia in view of the election of Barack Obama being elected. And Berlusconi replied, jokingly, Obama has all that's needed to get on with him, Medvedev, because he's young, he's handsome, and even tanned. Now that is, of course, politically totally incorrect, and it's racist, because insinuating tan means insinuating the color of his skin and mentioning that Obama was African American. What happened then was that Berlusconi then had another press conference, then he apologized, but he didn't really apologize, but it was taken up and debated, and we've analyzed that, and he didn't just get away with it. But Donald Trump got away with everything. And many people asked, why did so many women vote for Donald Trump? He was so sexist. He made such misogynist remarks. And Kasmude claims, and I think he's right, also others have talked about it and done research, that the anti-Mexican and anti-foreigner and xenophobic sentiments and policies were more important than being insulted in a sexist way. So I think that's important to know, to explain why the shamelessness works, and why not, for example, all women voted against Trump, which probably many of us would have expected. So what are some far-right populist rhetorical strategies apart from scandalization and provocation? Presenting and constructing oneself as victim, and as victim of big conspiracies, be them of George Soros, or of the opposition, or of the left wing, or of the liberals, or of the intelligentsia, or whatever. Speaking on behalf of the people, this is this typical argumentum ad populum, which provides the authenticity. I'm like you and I can speak for you, but I'm also above all the norms. So there's a small contradiction, an ambivalence, which they have to balance and make people still believe that they are one of them, although they are obviously not one of them. They're also very rich, like Donald Trump. The norms don't refer to them, but they're still sort of part of these people. Very important, the construction of the savior, making America great again, or Austria first, which we already heard in 1992, or Germany first. These are old slogans, we will make sure that you're protected, that the borders are closed, etc. Very important, the dead cat strategy, which goes in hand with the with provocation, which means that as soon as an uncomfortable debate is going on, you can metaphorically throw a cat on the table, a different topic, everybody will be distracted, and the uncomfortable agenda will be backgrounded. And the bad manners, as Benjamin Moffat has said, flouting all the Gricean principles, breaking taboos, anti-political correctness, being impolite, etc. So these are just some of these strategies, not to mention repetition and other tools, rhetorical tools. But what we also, I think, have to think of, and again, I'm talking about this blurring of boundaries, is what we call coarse civility. This is a concept taken from Wilhelm Heidmayer, a German sociologist whom I admire very much, who talks in German, we say rohe Bürgerlichkeit, who talks about the soft discriminatory utterances. They're not coded. Yeah, it's not the coded racist or anti-Semitic language which we also find. It's just rational. So you give rational arguments for shutting down borders, or for sort of not taking in refugees. And you have different kind of legitimation strategies, rationalization, and not sort of explicit exclusion. And this is sort of carried by civilized, polite manners. And so you have, again, a blurring of boundaries. And this is what's important to me. We have, well, you could go actually to Baumann's liquid modernity. It's not categorizable anymore in distinct categories. We have a blurring of boundaries between entertainment and information, between discrimination, soft discrimination, politeness, impoliteness, and different kinds of symbolic politics and traditional class politics. So all of that we can experience. So I'm coming to my examples. My first example is where you see how the coarse civility can be juxtaposed to the explicit racism. This poster is a poster of the far right, extreme far right, the Freedom Party in Austria, which propagated the cutting of benefits for children of EU migrants who were not living in Austria. So children outside of Austria, in Hungary, Romania, Poland, but also maybe in the Netherlands, should get less benefits than if the children would be living with their parents in Austria. Now, this goes against EU regulations completely. Nevertheless, it was propagated that the government is cutting benefits for children in foreign countries, not saying that the EU countries were meant, but actually insinuating globally, you know, Africa, for example. And then we have a woman from Africa posted there, but actually she's from Uganda, sort of supposed to illustrate this proposal, this policy proposal for EU migrants. Now, sort of the typical EU migrant from Poland is not a Muslim woman who has a colored skin color. And in that way, it was complete disinformation and allowed for a whole, as you can imagine, range of xenophobic associations. Then we have an example of the coarse civility which accompanies basically this poster, which was posted and uttered by the Chancellor, by the Prime Minister, when he said, "I do not believe that it is a good development when fewer and fewer people in Vienna get up in the morning to work, and in more and more families. It's only the children who get up in the morning, who go to school. It is not a good development when more and more people have no work and depend on minimum benefits." So what is this supposed to mean? Well, first of all, Vienna has a social democratic mayor and a government which is an oppositional government to the national government. So there is constant bashing on the city of Vienna from the side of the Conservative Party. Secondly, you see that there is absolutely no evidence, no facts. What does it mean? Fewer and fewer people, more and more families, more and more people depend on benefits. So it is an argument which provides, which speaks to some kind of big stereotype about people abusing the social system. But there are no statistics, there are no numbers, we have no evidence for that. And thirdly, it is against the migrants who only want benefits and don't work. So that is linked to cutting the money for children of migrants. So that would fit the whole policy. because migrants are lazy, they don't want to work, they depend on benefits, so those benefits should be cut. But this is sort of framed in a very different way than the poster, which uses blatant racist measures and elements. So now popular culture, as we experience it in Austria, you might have heard of Andreas Gabalier, and there are others. One of the most popular pop singers who sings in dialect, in Viennese and other regional dialects, and his songs are about romantic love, traditional gender roles, patriotism, nativism, and the homeland. Yeah? And he always turns up in typical folklore look in the famous Austrian lederhosen, which most of us never wear. Austria is not in lederhosen and Mozartkugels and so forth. And if you think about sort of films which have propagated these images, but he's walking around in this typical folklore look, and also with a shirt always in red and white carré, which is mountain climbing shirt. You see him on mountains here as well, and this is the cover of one of his CDs, and you see that he's posed in a very interesting pose. So it's insinuating, some people think, a swastika. Now, when he was confronted with this, he said, of course, this is not a swastika. Yeah? This is what you think, I'm just running on the mountain. And if you run, you have such a pose. So there was a debate about, is this a swastika? And as usual in popular culture and fiction, far right and extreme right can deny that they ever thought about saying something and breaking taboos. It has never occurred to them, and it's possibly you who think that, but not them who actually did this. And this became a symbol of sort of what you can do in respect to symbolic politics. And just to show you the kind of texts, and there were many, and Markus Reindorf has written a lot about also these texts of his songs, and there were many political debates about it, but just from one of his songs with the title My Grandfather Said, yeah, so it's appealing to tradition. I almost would have forgotten, there is that kind of woman too, who built on anything but femininity. So it's against those, career women like all of us. Yeah, it flatters us, but it doesn't turn us on. Yeah, nothing for men. Why does a girl today have to be like a man? Completely grim, almost in cramps from emancipation. And there's so much to be deconstructed in this brief text, so that you lose all joy in making out. But not all of us are into men. So we are actually men, although we have cramps and we don't look nice, we're grim because we can't laugh because we work. Yeah, we have lost all the femininity. I include myself because obviously it's about women, career women. And just to complement this, the program of the far right of the Austrian Freedom Party has a whole section on gender politics where they say women shouldn't work. They should just be at home and get children. So it actually realizes those policies and propagates and disseminates them to anybody who likes this kind of folks rock and roll. We much prefer to nibble at a real girl. So I won't go into that any longer, but you can see again how far-right identity and gender politics has become normalized in popular culture with the most popular Austrian singer, because his songs are widely disseminated, and he has won many prizes and is getting a lot of money with the sales of his songs. And finally now, again, the blurring of boundary, the message control via propaganda. This is my last example. I think I still have 5 minutes, if I may, which is how this kind of shameless normalization is controlled by the government now also in the Austrian media. And I would claim that this is the first step to urbanism, to a authoritarian culture in the media. So first of all, we start with big lies, which most politicians in the government have. Just again, think of Trump. He didn't lose the election. Sebastian Kurz said, I've closed the Balkan route for refugees, but we all know there are still refugees, and the Balkan route hasn't been closed, and also not by him, but by many countries, and there is a Turkish solution for that. But this was his achievement, and he repeated it throughout the election campaigns. There is pressure and control all the time, in the way that there are 60 people now employed in the chancellery only to do spin doctorism, sort of to brief the newspapers what they should write for the whole week, but also every day there are policy announcements and press releases and press conferences, and especially what we call Hintergrundgespräche. That means talks, background exclusive talks, where not all journalists are welcomed, and some are even not welcomed. And so there is a difference between media who are nice and media who are not nice to this government, which means they are critical about something. So there's also censorship by phone, which means there are interventions if an interview does not fit the rules. And we know that Kurz has personally phoned certain journalists and asked them to cut something out of interviews. So direct intervention is possible. It's still talked and challenged and criticized, but there is a huge budget. And here we come to the economic pressures. Not only is there a huge budget for PR and spin doctors, recently raised to 1 million euro for all ministries, there is also a huge budget for adverts in newspapers, but only to so-called nice newspapers who don't criticize the government. And the other newspapers have thus lost a lot of money because they are not supported anymore by the government. There are almost no independent quality newspapers in Austria because it's so largely dependent on state money and on support of governmental money via advertisements. So this is about the subsidies. So that actually a quite well-known journalist said we should not talk about a liberal democracy in Austria anymore. We should talk about a tabloid democracy. And we have what I already talked about, placing ads in friendly media. And Kickel, who we already saw in one of those posters, actually explicitly said, we don't want to post any adverts in two very well-known critical newspapers, but the extreme right newspaper Zur Zeit still gets a lot of subsidies. This Mr. Fleischmann is in charge of the media agenda officially, but he's also the personal spin doctor of the Prime Minister. We have a weekly and daily agenda setting, and that is really following the dead cat strategy in the sense of we want this to be debated in television, in the media, and not any other agenda. And we have recently, this has become transparent, that very rich friends of the ÖVP and also banks buy huge parts of newspapers, and in that way government-friendly editors receive positions, something which Orban has done in Hungary throughout, and you might know that the last critical Hungarian radio station has been closed some months ago. So we see these steps, and now these steps don't all occur simultaneously. This is a development. I've summarized this now, but all of this is a development. The pop music, the interventions into media, the various postings, and the course civility all happens at various different times. And in that way, we have a dissemination which doesn't happen everywhere from a tipping point on, but it creeps in. Yeah, and it slowly comes into the mainstream and into the center. And I think this is important to realize. We don't have a sort of mainstreaming or normalization from one day to the next, or sort of a tipping point and suddenly everything has changed. It creeps in slowly, step by step, by challenging justice, by challenging the media, by supporting certain pop culture and not other, by subsidies to somebody and not other people. So it's a slow development which makes it so difficult to spot and detect. And I think this is why, and I really appeal to everybody, one has to be very aware of this. One really has to look and not just get angry all the time, but really be aware of such developments, and whatever you can do something about it. So basically what we see is that evidence-based news are delegitimized and alternative facts are legitimized in these step-by-step normalization processes. And especially, as I already said, the common sense, the non-logical reasoning, which is part and parcel of propaganda, of manipulation, of the way of getting old values acceptable again, of trying to turn the clock back in respect to gender politics, the example I showed about Andreas Gabalier. So the most important function, in my view, of shameless normalization, I've talked about most of those 6, so I want to just summarize with 2 points. The one is challenging constitutive democratic principles when attacking the free press and well-evidenced empirical facts, when blurring the boundaries between entertainment and information, and thus making it even more acceptable, because, if you hear nice songs, it becomes even more acceptable. You're not aware of the messages which are disseminated by that, or the posters which you look at on the street, and that provocation, this shameless normalization by a provocation, facilitates the implementation and the normalization of policies. That means by distracting via provocation and scandalization and all the different measures and elements I've talked about, such politicians can actually implement exclusionary and undemocratic policies frequently without they being noticed. It takes time until you notice it. And again, I want to give you the Trumpian example of what happened at the Mexican borders, but what actually the debate was about, the women in Congress, and again, the insulting of sexist insults and offenses, but actually at the same time, children were separated from their parents at the Mexican borders and put into cages. So, and people didn't notice at first because everybody was so much involved into a totally different symbolic debate. And I think this is the way that media and all of us actually have to be very much aware of what is happening, and then reject this kind of invitation to talk about the distractions and actually come back to the real policies. And this is what I would like to stop with, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much.